So we're going to kind of switch gears for this next presentation. So we just went from the very wide world of broad-based language models, and I'm going to show you a little bit about the final frontier on the more zoomed-in world of real-time pricing with less general but more specialized neural networks. And this here is a little preview of the kind of cool things that you can do once you start playing around with those toys. So the theme for this particular style of neural networks is a very, very old and human problem. Bear with me, the notation might be a little funny, but you have a family of problems, F, and they're parameterized by that family F. And then we have this operator O that, given any point in that family of problems, spits out the solution. And classically, humans encounter these families of problems, and they usually have a slow method to compute solutions one at a time. And what you really want to do is you want to try to break down that slow operation into a collection of simple operations. And so you can bifurcate time and accuracy. So you can get your solution as good as you want and as quickly as you want. So just to justify my statement, this is indeed a very old theme. Let's go to 2000 BC. What kind of family of problems might humans be struggling with at that point in time? Well, the basic quadratic equations. So you have a family of problems, namely all the quadratics, parameterized by numbers A, B, and C. And for any collection of these three numbers, you have the two solutions, Z0 and Z1. Here you're allowing yourself to work over the complex numbers, so bear with me with that. And so how do you actually solve this kind of problem? Well, the astute observation is that there's a simpler family of problems, namely those that are degenerate, where you just have 1 in front of the Z squared and a Q for the constant term. And for those, the familiar solution is the square root, either the positive and negative square root of that number. So what's the trick? Well, the Babylonians noticed that, hey, if I know how to solve the square root in the simple cases, I can actually build up the full solution using the quadratic formula. And so here you have this stone table where you'd be recording in advance some known square roots, so that when you needed to solve a full quadratic, well, you could just look up the square root on the fly, and the rest is simple addition and division. And so they were the first to perhaps bifurcate time and accuracy by spending some time up front to compute some square roots to a very high precision, and then just plug it into this quick formula over here. So the leitmotif is represent your solutions operator as a composition of simple functions, and that allows you to bifurcate time and accuracy. All right, so let's flip it over to about 2080. It's really around 2018, but I guess that's a small error on that kind of scale. And what kind of family of problems are we now struggling with? Well, here's a typical finance PD. You've got a local vol, local rate structure. And how are you going to deal with this? Well, once again, as usual, we have a family of, in this case, partial differential equations. And we know how to solve these. We have these familiar tools such as finite differences or Monte Carlo, which will allow us to get the practical solution to the accuracy that we want. The cost that you have to pay, though, is it takes a really long time to dial that up because it's very slow to converge. And maybe even, in finance, sometimes we don't have such a well-posed problem. So we don't have a clean PDE with a boundary solution. We just have some kind of thing that tells us that for some set of inputs, we have some price. And so the question is, can we find a mesh-free representation of this solutions operator? Because we know it exists from something like Monte Carlo, but it's very slow. And the answer is yes. And as you may suspect from the theme of the conference, is the trick is to use a neural network to actually build up this full solution. And on the right-hand side here, you might be wondering what this representation is analogous to the Babylonians' square root tables. This is actually a nomogram. And the idea here is it's a graphic representation of the Black-Scholes equation. So in a very simple case where you can play around with this diagram to quickly look up solutions with a pen and paper. So how has this actually been done in finance? Well, I'm a mathematician by training, so you want to start out with the simplest cases. And so, your hello world is Black-Scholes and swaps because those are pretty simple. But as we know, derivatives get very complicated very quickly. So the kind of journey that we've been on at Riskfuel is the first one we played around with was FX barriers. For that, you have about 80 dimensions and you have some interesting effects, but it's still relatively manageable. The next ones that we started tackling were Bermudan swaptions. So there you start getting more and more dimensions. And you have that, the swaption aspect combined with the Bermudan gives a little bit of an interesting interplay. But where it really, really gets interesting is when you start talking about things like multi-asset autocallables and you're in the thousands of input dimensions, because you might have quantos, so you have your FX vol surfaces. For each asset, you have a full vol surface, and then you have your interest rates and dozens upon dozens of interesting trade parameters. So these are very discontinuous, very interesting assets to try to price on the fly. All right, so that was kind of the lay of the land and where it's heading. And the question is, well, how do you do this? So I'm going to go much more basic than my colleague and go all the way back to, what is a deep neural net? I mean, interrogation mark, not necessarily deep right away, in theory. And so the mathematical foundation here is that basically you can approximate any function with a single hidden layer. So that sounds kind of silly. You have some affine transformation, your favorite non-polynomial function, let's say ReLU for the sake of concreteness, and just using those two widgets, you can get arbitrarily close to any function. So any function meaning, in theory, you could handle this multi-asset autocallable using a single hidden layer. Or formally, people tend to talk about smooth function, but it's really just piecewise continuous because that's all you need. So you can allow jumps and things like that. The catch is you pay a bit of a cost in backprop when you're trying to train your neural network. But basically, any function is fair game, including those autocallables and all their infamous discontinuities and their payoffs. And the nice thing, too, is even when you're taking a single hidden layer, such as this one, you have control of the error in terms of the number of neurons. That's giving you the flexibility of the model, so that reduces the model due to the network itself, and the number of known function values. So that's basically as your training set goes up in size and the placement of those points goes up in size, you can basically make your error go to zero. So, okay, why isn't everybody just using single hidden layer neural networks, and why do we dive into things like transformers? Just a few citations if you want to look up the details of this. Well, let's shift our perspective. So that first slide was really a statement about, very, very simple neural networks. So if you're a mathematician, you might like that because it's super simple to describe. But there's also a counterpart to that, which is depth. So what can you do if you, fix your width to be something fairly non-large, and then you allow yourself to go as deep as you want? So bring the deep back in deep neural networks. And there you have a similar statement where you can actually play the same game. If you allow yourself to go arbitrarily deep in terms of your number of layers, you get back the statement from before. And so the question then becomes, well, how can you play these two facts against each other to get something that will be not just theoretically true, but also empirically and algorithmically discoverable and usable? So the playoff is quite clear that shallow networks need exponentially more neurons than deep ones. So if you're trying to approximate some function, I'm just trying to, here it goes, the layers kind of blow up in size if you're constrained to just two, and something where you need a huge number of nodes in each layer like this one, you could get away with a very, very small, say 3-layer neural network. Maybe a little exercise is to think about, what kind of function would be trivial to approximate using 3 layers, but very, very difficult to approximate using only 2. Give you a hint. If you think back to your calculus courses, you might come up with one. So, couple of theorems and places to look up facts about this. And so this brings us back to how do we do this in practice? So in practice, you may, if you're in a foundational setting, then you care about accuracy up to a certain extent. So you might be fine with using ChatGPT. If it tells you garbage once in a while, you just use your brain and say, yeah, okay, that was garbage. I'm going to look up this author. They don't actually exist. No big deal. I was able to rectify this. But in a context of pricing and when your portfolio is at risk, you don't want to leave it up to chance. So you're not going to want to use some ChatGPT style thing to price your portfolio derivatives. You're going to want a specialized network that you understand inside out. And the counterpart to this is that if you're not dealing with arbitrary functions, you can use domain knowledge to your advantage. So two kind of meta points here is, one is that the training data matters. So for these general purpose models, you can throw whatever you want at it and it's kind of learning some average behavior. But in a case of, say, an autocallable, you're going to care about where exactly your training data matters. So here I'm showing a generic slice of the high dimensional hypersurface of payoffs of some autocallable. And you can see that those red dots here are representing some Monte Carlo pricer. And you see they kind of go down, they jump up, they go down, they jump up, oh, big cliff, jump down, jump up, jump up, jump down. There's these discontinuities all over the place. So you can't just throw generic training data at this and hope for the best. You have to make sure that you're nailing those weird effects that come up due to coupon payments and dividends kind of ping-ponging across each other all over the place. So the data placement is quite important here. The second thing is the architecture also matters. So, I mean, earlier we were talking about things like, simple feed-forward networks, and you can probably you can handle Black-Scholes and swaps, and perhaps even things like FX barrier options that are relatively smoothly behaved using just vanilla feed-forward networks and some good training data. But when you're dealing with something like this and you want to get accuracy, down to the penny on payoffs in the hundreds of dollars, you can't leave that up to chance. And so the way to crack that nut and get to these thousands of dimensions of inputs for autocallables while getting that ultra high accuracy, we do work with transformer-inspired architecture. So here you have kind of one of our things. Typically you have to play around with how you're going to organize your assets, your vol surface, how you're going to tokenize those things. Basically nothing works off the shelf, but you can get it to really nail these things down. And so let's talk a little bit about this multi-asset autocallable. So you have thousands of dimensions. This means full equity volatility surfaces. You have Quantos, you have a full FX vol surface as well. You have interest rate curves, and then you have all these juicy trade specifics, like when are the observations happening? Do you have a memory effect? What are the things that are going to bounce you up and down all over the place? And the key is that if you actually build a targeted and large enough training set, you can price those. And the huge payoff is kind of insane. So I want to talk a little bit about this dashboard and what this means. It looks kind of like a standard trader's dashboard, maybe with the reverse color because we're a little bit more hacker. But the catch and the main difference is that this dashboard is something that updates second by second. So you could be sitting there and you have here actually I have a portfolio of a couple thousand autocallables. And what you're looking at is what your day could look like as a trader, where you're getting pretty much second by second updates on your P&L. And then, hey, you want to know what your delta is based on each of the stocks that are lying in your various autocallables. Well, you've got that also live right here. Your Vega right here, your exposure, you want your aggregate delta, your aggregate Vega, you got that, your exposure delta, your exposure Vega. And then, hey, you want to drill down and pick specific stocks and look at your specific Vega for that specific stock or your P&L. Well, you've got that here on the right-hand side as well. And all of this is just happening in under a second every time it evaluates the whole portfolio against changes in the market on just a few cores. So I'll leave it to your imagination what you can actually achieve with this kind of a setup. And as promised, I guess I got my 5 minutes remaining. I said I would be 5 minutes under just to build in some slack. All right, going to hand it over to Miriam, our next speaker.